Almost 200 years ago, a terrible disease called cholera reached the parish of Leeds. Little was understood about this horrifying illness, which, rumour had it, could infect a perfectly healthy person one day and then turn them blue before they died the next. Nicknamed the King of Terrors, it led to widespread fear and panic. It was unclear how it spread, but it was believed that foul or night air was to blame, and so people were urged to be clean, whitewash their homes, use chloride of lime, help to clear up the filthy streets, and deal with their waste sensibly. The poor were particularly vulnerable. So it seems very apt then that I should be lecturing on this topic when we're suffering from the effects of a pandemic. Society is having to deal with a new disease about which little is known, has led to government encouraging us to clean up our acts by using hand sanitizing gel, antibacterial sprays on surfaces, and even having to wear masks in public areas. And the poor are particularly vulnerable. What an amazing coincidence this is. So let's go back in time to Hunslet in the 1830s, because this really was a remarkable place. We forget that this was one of the world's first industrializing settlements. And the changes had been huge in that late Georgian period. One of the things that Roy referred to when he last spoke was the wonderful, rich collection of the Thoresby Society. And I think that that really, I hope, will be reflected today, because this magnificent map of the borough by Baines and Newsom in 1839 shows the actual borough of Leeds. But what it does, because it's in colour, it shows very clearly the interrelationship of Hunslet, this area, this out township to the south of the River Aire, to the rest of the borough and parish of Leeds. I think what you notice immediately is that even though it's industrializing, there are still large areas of agricultural land, and many there were still clothiers, and they were a dual occupation. They also were involved in agriculture. Now, one of the earliest plans we have is the Tuke Plan of 1781. And why this is fantastic is it shows you the distribution of settlement in 1781. Just look at that vast open area. So it didn't really matter whether Town Street, which is marked there in the turquoise, did have crowded yards, etc., because there was plenty of fresh air and plenty of space in which you could get rid of all human waste. You can see from this map, it was a settlement with lots of hamlets around it. You have in the dark blue Woodhouse Hill, which had been famous for its colliers and its tanners. You then move across to the light green Hunslet Carr, agricultural settlement on the periphery of the moorland area. Across to the purple, which is Hunslet Hall, one of the great Tudor mansions of Leeds, the second largest house during the half-tracts of the 1680s. And then you've got this red of Hunslet Lane, where it literally has huge merchants' houses. This was full of places like Sundial House, which we'll see more of later, where the merchants of Leeds in that late 18th and early 19th century were increasingly concerned about the burgeoning population in the township and wished to escape from the noise, filth, etc. of the central inn township and go out to the periphery south of Leeds Bridge, where they built these huge mansions where they could have not only their house but also their workshops, and there was plenty of ground for the tenterfields. We also have there the black mark of the settlement called Hunslet Moorside. And again, it's this strange mixture of agriculture, cloth making on the old domestic system, but this settlement was on the cusp of huge change. Now, most people know Hunslet because of the famous Leeds pottery, and also as well because of the wonderful 1758 Brandling's wagonway, which brought cheap coal from Middleton collieries down into Leeds. And of course, it was the site of Blenkinsop's two-cylinder geared steam locomotive of 1812-13, which shows so beautifully here on Walker's sketch, which shows in the background John Smeaton's pumping engine, which was taking the water out of the deep mines of Middleton. Now, I love this sketch. This is from the Thoresby collection. And why, again, I get excited about this is it is the finest example of this watercolor painting by Dussault. It is so crisp. And what I've done is overlay that by showing you what this shot circa 1830, what it was like. Dussault, a French artist coming here to teach watercolor painting in Leeds, went out to Rope Hill and painted what he saw. And what he saw was this huge contrast between the open area of market gardens, where people were labouring to get food into Leeds market for the burgeoning populace, but also as well that strange eclectic mills, mix of the new potteries, the woolen mills. Again, we forget that Leeds is at the cusp of these changes. And also as well, Bowers Glassworks, which will feature later in our story. And it's oft forgotten that cotton mills were in Leeds at this period. Leeds people were always looking across the Pennines and being grateful they didn't come from there, but also really were impressed by the fortunes the cotton magnates were making and hoped and prayed that this could happen in Leeds. And in Hunslet, Ard Walker inherited Storey's mill, which comes in later to the story, Waterloo mill, which was built as a huge cotton mill. And what's been interesting about my new research is that was the first and oldest cotton mill. But not only did we have these mills, we had wire works, with vitriol works, with fulling mills. It was an industrializing settlement. And as these mills, these places which utilized the new technology were built on a scale unimaginable a generation before. You know, if you were one of these domestic clothiers in your small cottage, there clacketing away with your wife on the spinning wheel and you on the loom, and then you look down the road and here they are building these huge 4- and 5-story mills where you've got your new spinning jennies, etc. in there. It must have been a huge change and an obvious threat to your livelihood. And these new mills, you didn't need to have served your 7-year apprenticeship to make sure that you were skilled enough to make cloth that could be displayed in the cloth halls. Oh no, you literally could be taught very speedily how to use these new machines of wonder. And therefore it drew in a whole raft of unskilled labour who could work on the cheap for these people who had invested a fortune in new technology. Now, this slide's important, and it really shows that phenomenal growth in population. Here we've got in 1775, 3,825 people in Hunslet. The vast majority of those, as I've already stated, colliers, clothiers, agriculturists. What you have is this huge change, so that by 1851, you now have 19,500 people there, a 5-fold increase in 76 years. And it is that huge influx of people being crammed together, some of them in the old cottages, which were subdivided, some in the old mansion houses, which were subdivided, and people were living cheek by jowl. But also in that period, you had phenomenal growth in housing. They were throwing up, and I think that is the word, row after row of cheap working class housing, sometimes in yards, sometimes in folds, sometimes on green field sites, but all of them without piped water, without effective sewage, and no effective means of disposing of their rubbish. Now, one of the great surprises as I began to dig deeper into the Hunslet history was that just how magnificent the houses were in this period. I put this one on because this is Burton House, and it is still there, remarkably. It's one of those rare survivors. But this was the home of a man called Robert Busk. Those that are familiar with the Leeds history know that Jacob Busk came across from Gothenburg in the early part of the 18th century, one of the great merchant houses of Leeds, buying up the cloth and exporting it mainly to Northern Europe in Busk's case. But as his family go down to his children and his grandchildren, they diversify. They take the family fortune, and this gentleman, Robert Busk, who lived here, was into flax in a big way. And he was not only trading with London, but also with Russia. And he went and lived in Russia eventually in St. Petersburg. But what he's doing is bringing flax back into Hunslet. And he is one of the first to start the flax mills in Hunslet again. And one of the pieces of research I'm doing at the moment is I'm trying to date his flax mill to see if it predates John Marshall, who of course has always been the great hero of the piece when it comes to Leeds being at the forefront of flax technology. I put this slide on. Those of you who know Hunslet, this is now Morrison's here at Hunslet. But look at the size of Grove Cottage in 1850. It is like Roundy Park Mansion. And I'll just give you a moment to let that settle in. Here you have in Hunslet, in the first part of the 19th century, a vast house called a cottage with its own stable box, brewery, its hothouses, its greenhouses, its bowling green, down to the huge lake at the bottom of the garden here, fed by Barmbek. And this is the house of the Walker family, and in particular a man called Ard Walker, who expanded and built this huge mill at the bottom here, which is called Waterloo Mill. You also have the Leithley House, again, one of these beautiful mansions, and the home of the first mayor of Leeds under the Reform Corporation, Sundial House, now opposite what you will know as Costco in Hunslet. So you have these people. Now, the reason I'm dwelling on this to start with is that when cholera breaks out in 1832, you have living within the bounds of Hunslet families of great wealth and great influence who had a paternalistic view of their role and responsibility to the local population. The thing was, as all these people flooded in, the number of people who were poor rose speedily. And unfortunately, Hunslet, like everywhere else, was prone to trade depressions. And in the 1820s in particular, many people were out of work and desperately poor. So the township had a fantastic new plan made and a survey by Henry Teal. And what this shows you is the area 1824. I put here Penny Hill Morrison so that those who know Hunslet know where we are now. And this is the mill that I showed you a moment ago. And you can see just how spread out the street is. This is the market street. This is where on a Friday the people of Hunslet gathered to buy their fruit and veg. And up opposite where Morrison's is now, there's only the tower left, but here is the chapel, the communal place of worship. Now, if you were to stray down those yards, this is the kind of housing that you would see. Some of it was brick built with thatch roof, single story, extremely small, often comprising only one room of 12 feet square. The main street itself was very much housed in the past with a mixture of 17th and 18th century housing. Nothing that was and on top of that, what we also had was this plethora of new housing built in the 1800s to 1840s to house the burgeoning population. Now, what you had here, because of rapid change, rapid influx of people, no sanitation, poor water supply, you had an absolute recipe for disaster. Now, the thing is, and what is surprising, is that in the epidemics of 1832 and 1834, there were only 55 deaths. Why was that so small? Well, let's just look at the disease which was to strike with this strange amalgam of new mills, vitriol factories, glass works, cotton mills, and then huge areas of open land. And into this area came this strange disease which nobody knew how it struck. It was frightening mainly because you turned blue, and the press made a great deal of this. It's a bit like our press today. Anything that's sensational, yeah, let's just that up so it makes our readership cringe and want to know more and buy more papers. But basically, it's an acute affection characterized by nausea, vomiting, frequent yellowish watery stools, colicky pains, severe muscular cramps, rapid and severe dehydration, and then you go into shock, you collapse, and your skin wrinkles. Terminal patients have almost been skeletal in their appearance. It almost certainly originated in India, and it caused many deaths amongst the British troops in India in 1817, and then progressed steadily across Asia to Europe, reaching the Baltic ports in 1831. Now that's important because Leeds was trading with these Baltic ports all the time, particularly for the importation of flax for the flax spinning mills in Leeds. Now, England had its first case reported in Sunderland in November of that year. They put in the press this wonderful shot of the person turning blue, laid prostate, and looking skeletal. The fear factor. Now, what did they think caused this? Well, the Miasma Theory held that diseases such as cholera were caused by a miasma, which is ancient Greek for pollution, a noxious form of bad air, also known as night air. And that basically this theory was that it was caused by this miasma emanating from rotting organic material. Now, cholera had broken out in Yewdall in April 1832, and several deaths had occurred there. And the Leeds intelligence says the pestilence has gained a footing in Yorkshire. Now, Yewdall was only 40 miles away, and there was constant trade, whether by barge, whether by coach, by cart, even vagrants on the tramp up the towpath. And so on the 14th of April, no vessel was to leave Yewdall for the West Riding without a clean bill of health. But despite that, it still came to Leeds. 28th of May, the first case. And we forget that the air and colder navigation was the M1 of its age. It was absolutely rammed with traffic. I love this painting by Atkinson Grimshaw, about 50 years from when we're speaking, but it still shows you just the volume of trade coming up to the Leeds warehouses and the Leeds wharfs, everything from timber to bales of flax, and taking away the woolen cloth for export. Now, I'm just going to put this on because some of the places I will be referring to shortly are located here. Here we have Leeds Bridge coming across here. You come across and along Hunslet Lane, past Costco and Brains, and then the motorway, and then you've got the Larchfield Mills. These were really important woolen mills of a man called Tim Nevans, an Irishman who'd made a real success of getting the new technology to work for him and producing some of the finest cloth in the country, which was exported all over the world. He had a particular relationship with the Red Indians of North America, where his cloth was greatly valued. And here we have Bauer's great glassworks. He was making crown glass for windows for the number of houses which were being built, but he was also making bottles, everything from beer to sulfuric acid. He was a really successful businessman, went on to become a billionaire, and that is no word of a lie. And then, of course, here with Waterloo mills and the famous Leeds pottery. Now, when the disease struck, Hunslet met, all the main members met in the Church of St. Mary's, and they decided that they would set up their own Board of Health to mirror that of Leeds Board of Health. They thought that they needed to be proactive. And this comes back to the great Christian ethos that the elite had at that time. And they decided themselves that they needed to go out and survey where the likely places were for this cholera to outbreak and what steps they needed to take to remove the organic material which they thought caused the disease. And so they went into all the alleys where many of these people would never, ever have dreamt of going. And they did a survey of the habitations of the poor in order to ascertain their cleanliness, the necessities, and their general state of health. It took 14 days, but they were shocked when they came back. They were stunned at the conditions in which the poor members of their township were living. And so they immediately set up a fund out of which their suffering neighbours might be relieved. Now, it is amazing that they did know that whitewashing would kill germs. In Leeds, if you go back to the plagues in the 17th century, they whitewashed their homes then. And recent research has shown it is an effective cleansing agent. And what they decided was that people had to be responsible for cleaning up their own act. They'd given the whitewash, they'd given the brushes, all that was free, but they had to do something themselves. The other thing that they were shocked at were the contents of these houses. Many of these people didn't have decent blankets in which to cover themselves up should they become ill. And so they immediately purchased 450 blankets and gave them away. Medical care then had to be paid for, but it was decided that they themselves would pay for 2 doctors, Beckett and Gisborne, who were employed to attend the sick. And then the ladies, these middle-class ladies, decided and took it upon themselves that they would visit the sick, and they made shirts and slips and waistcoats and petticoats for the destitute and needy. And what comes across from all the evidence is the generosity not only of spirit, but also as well of the way in which these people risked their own health to go and help the needy. Now, nationally, these boards of health were mirrored throughout the country. And I put this cartoon on because the press began to lampoon the elite by saying, well, you should have done this long before this. You know, where is your Christian duty? You people, you vicars of the C of E, where were you? Why are you shocked by this? You should have been out looking after your flock. And I love this cartoon where the man up there is because saying, the scent lies strong here. Do you see anything at all? But this is where they had to go. This was literally off Church Street, Chapel Street as it was then, i.e. near Morrison's. And look at the state of it. Single story dwelling made of brick, stone thatched roof. To the left of the screen, you've got the privies. It's unpaved. There is no running water. It's a total disaster waiting to happen. And all this was near this church, this chapel with its fine new tower by Chantrell. Now, it's all right having the potential of people dying in number within your bounds, but let's assume that they do start to die in number. Where are you going to bury them? So this Board of Health decided to do a survey of that chapel yard. There were 2 already, and they found that in those 2 yards, there wasn't 5 square yards to be found in which graves could be dug more than 3 or 4 deep. It was full. And so they took one of the parts of the open moorland, field number 31 on the recent survey that had been made by Teal, to try, the survey being made to try and increase the amount of money that they could get for poor relief. And this was near the workhouse. And it was found that they could bury these people 10 feet deep. But they noted that should people get cholera, they would all be thrown in the pit without distinction of rank or station in society. Absolutely radical stuff. And what's great is that up until relatively recently, that little cholera graveyard survived. And here we have that gravestone where eventually the 55 inhabitants of the township of Hunslet were to be found. Now, that gravestone, by the way, now is at the cemetery at Woodhouse Hill. Now, you look to those leaders of Hunslet society and what they were doing to help. Well, this is Joshua Bower. He was a Methodist, a great nonconformist, absolute workaholic, proud of his new dynasty as he saw it. He'd come from absolute poverty and had, by huge amounts of labor and ingenuity, made himself and pushed himself not only into the glass industry, but also into the chemical industry as well. And what he decided was his best way of helping the community was to give 4,000 portions of chloride of lime to purify these people's dwellings. And it's great that the instructions still survive there. And you had to place the contents in a glass bottle to make the liquid. You had to sprinkle it on the floor. And then a tablespoon of the liquid should be put down neat on any crevice, drain, cesspool or water closet to get rid of any noxious effluvia. And then you had to leave the bottle with the stop off in the room to get rid of it. I'm glad I wasn't in that particular room. Now, we know quite a bit about the cholera simply because of this gentleman, John Yewdall. He had been a clothier and in 1820, during the Depression, had been pushed out of work and managed to get labour at the new bar on the Dewsbury Road. He was a very literate individual, later in 1827 to publish a whole raft of poems called the Toll Bar and other poems, which tell you about life in Hunslet in 1827. Wonderful insight. But he keeps for the Board of Health detailed records. And on the 1st of August, he said that there was huge suffering of people from the disease in cholera. And he decided that he should ask for additional medical care, which was forthcoming. And then another doctor was added to the list of people visiting the poor. At the November meeting, he stated that cholera was still there and that it was in a more malignant form than ever before. And as a result, 27 out of the 50 people identified with the disease had died. 46 had already been buried in this new graveyard. There was a crisis in the community. Now, the management of that crisis had already cost the ratepayers of Hunslet £300. In those days, an absolute fortune. But Yewdall argued that they needed another 250. Now, fortunately, December that year was bitterly cold and the outbreak came to an end. Now, what had they learned from this? They'd learned that housing was poor in many of the working class areas. The water supply was dreadful. Sanitation was appalling. And so any proactive community would have at that juncture tried to put right those ills, but they didn't. Once it was over, everybody breathed a sigh of relief. They'd got to pay off all the money that they had distributed before, so they'd had an appeal for that. And so nothing was done. So no surprises that it was going to return. Now, Roy Yates, at his last lecture, mentioned the great Dr. Baker, who produced his detailed report on the state of Leeds and cholera in 1832. But why it is such a great piece of work is, he worked with Charles Fowler to produce this cholera plan. And why that is so important is it begins to show the interrelationship between overcrowding and the spread of the disease. And so what you can see here on his plan of 1833 is Chapel Street, which we saw earlier, crowded, rammed with people. Thwaite Gate by the river, same thing. Little Hunslet, a relatively new housing area, or that of the new back-to-backs, Pottery Field, and opposite Pym Nevins Larchfield Mills. Leeds had had 702 deaths, and he was still convinced that miasma theory was right. He noted that there were 755 cases in streets that lacked water, sewage, and paving, and he realized that overcrowding was a key issue, but what he didn't do was link it to the drinking water. He believed that if you eradicated foul air, you would eradicate the risk of disease, and that was also shared by the Hunslet Board of Health. He came back in 1834, but in terms of Hunslet itself, not a great deal of deaths. It just was a terrible, terrible shock. Now, by 1849, the population has burgeoned again to 17,000. And this time, it was the heart of the disease in Leeds. There were 884 cases, and 1 in 40 of the entire population of Hunslet died. It was truly dreadful. Why was it so appalling? Why was it so bad? Well, I think we get some idea about why it was bad when we read J. Smith's report on the condition of Leeds in 1845. Because in essence, what he was saying was that on the opposite side of the river, stretching towards the west, there's an extensive flat on which a considerable extent of buildings has late time been erected. And it is the chief extension to the town. The flat is traversed by 2 brooks, and these form the natural main sewers of the district, but the flow of water in them is retarded because of artificial obstructions. It retains masses of putrescent matter. I hope for those of you who are eating your lunch that this is having the desired effect to make you stop eating and listen more clearly to my speech. Now, why we're in a real luck is that in the Thoresby archives, we have the record of a man who actually was living through this time with his father. And John Killingbeck wrote in the 1890s the history of Hunslet in draft, which was never published. His archive in 3 huge boxes is in the Thoresby Society. And why his reminiscences of the 1849 epidemic is so important is he not only lived through it, but he can tell us in his own words what it was like. He wrote, "It's the housing problem. The houses were back to back and generally very small, regardless of the number in the family. We knew many instances where it was common for 6, 8, or 10 to occupy only 1 bedroom. The large Podman open midden with a closet for a dozen or more families, with no inspection. It did much to pollute the air. Every street, alley or fold as they were called, had its open, nasty, filthy gutter, wide or narrow, and in many streets there were 2, one on each side. This filthy condition caused many letters to be sent to the public paper, not condemning them, but attributing to them the aggravation, if not the origin." And I just put this one back on to remind you of what he was talking about. Now, the great fair, the great feast of Hunslet was, of course, the Hunslet feast, which was held on the 12th and 13th of August. In a society today where many of us take for granted holidays, this was the holiday, along with Christmas and Easter, of the working classes. And it was looked forward to. And just as we're looking forward to Christmas at the moment, and we don't want any lockdown, well, the people of Hunslet in 1849 were no different. They didn't want lockdown. They wanted their feast to go ahead, and it did on the 12th and 13th of August. And John Killingbeck remembered that one day many were enjoying themselves in the show or the theatre on Chapel Street and were buried the next day. On the 1st of September 1849, the Leeds Mercury stated, "We are sorry to have still to report an increase in cholera in Leeds and some of the out townships. The locality where it is most fatal, Hunslet, furnishes during this week no less than 53 deaths and since the commencement of the disease, 184. Local officials provided every means of sanitation again, lime wash, brushes, and this time new disinfectants. They also gave out free brandy, arrowroot, and beef tea to strengthen the resisting powers of the system. I would certainly have been at the first of the queues for the brandy. They had in this time employed 3 medical men, Cullen, Gisborne, and Brooke, who, it was recorded, valiantly entered the homes of the victims at great risk to themselves. But it just got worse. And so another doctor, Dr. Brameld, he was called in as well. Now, what we also had in Hunslet was if you travelled to your place of work where you were cheek by jowl with hundreds of other labourers, and this again was literally ripe for you to catch the disease. This is Hunslet Mills. It still survives today and is currently being refurbished as modern flats. And this was the great flax mill of Mr. Wilkinson. John Wilkinson, along with his brother, started this, was known to say of victims of cholera, no one died of cholera except those who are very poor and very dirty. Well, you can imagine how well that went down with the local populace, and there was no sympathy at all when a few days later he fell victim himself. But those mills will feature in our story later on. So if you get this disease, what on earth are you going to take for it? What cures are there? If you believe you've inhaled it and it's come that way, well, what do you do? What do you take? And this is Robert Cruikshank's great cartoon, which was lampooning the Board of Health and how they were trying to give some cure-all to the people who had caught it. And you can see here, the poor man befuddled. What does he do? Sometimes they said, oh, well, if you starve, you will definitely get better. You will get rid of it from your system. Others were these pills, which of course did no good whatsoever. And then an emetic, we won't go into that. But fortunately in Hunslet, salvation was at hand. This came in the form of a man called Captain Waterton. Now, Captain Waterton was a fantastic, we call him traveller. He was a gentleman who travelled throughout the world. He had been in the army. He'd gone out to the West Indies, where he had perfected a powder treatment for yellow fever. And then he'd been posted out to Eastern Europe, where cholera was rife. And he found that this strange powder, which he had perfected, worked there. So Captain Waterton was the great man who came to the aid of the Board of Health and said, I will distribute free of charge to everyone in the out township of Hunslet these powders. I will make them available to everyone. He lived with his wife in this period of 1849 at this quite wonderful house, which later Waterton Hall it's called. This is from the watercolour in the Thoresby Society collection. And this is where his wife and he was living. Now, during the 1832 cholera epidemic, number of cases in Leeds have been so bad, they'd opened a cholera hospital virtually where West Yorkshire Playhouse is today. And the people of Leeds didn't want it. There had been riots, the windows had been bricked. Yet it reached a stage in the latter half of 1849 that was so bad that the Board of Health said, no, we need a hospital and we need it urgently. Nobody wanted to give any premises at all for these patients because they were worried that after the pandemic, they will be tainted. But Captain Waterton had leased Waterloo Mills and he said, no, I need to do something about this. You can have one of the floors of the mill as your cholera hospital. And so the Hunslet Cholera Hospital opened on one of the floors of the mills. Now, you look at remarkable survivors in evidence. In Thackeray Medical Museum, in their archive, the matron who was appointed to look after these patients kept a day book, and that is still with us today. We haven't got time to go into all the detail, but it is a remarkable piece of work. It really is. The first patient was admitted to Waterloo Mill here, as you can see, surrounded by fields, away from everything. The first patient was admitted at 4 o'clock on Wednesday, the 22nd of August, 1849, where Mary Hutchinson, a 66-year-old domestic servant from Hunslet, and Mary Pemberton, a 62-year-old domestic servant from Bowers Glassworks, sought immediate assistance. Under the skilled hands of Dr. Pullen, Hutchinson was discharged cured a week later, and Pemberton on the 19th of September. There was great success here. The infected clothing of victims was taken off them as they arrived at the hospital, and it was carried to a place way out in the moorlands of Hunslet known as the Dancing Pogs. And in that isolated spot, large furnaces were built to provide hot water for washing the bedding and clothing from the hospitals. The patients' apparel was destroyed and burnt, and women were employed to undertake this dangerous and unpleasant task, and in addition to being well paid, were well supplied with brandy. It seems as though it's an excellent cure-all. Now, this picture here is Organ Fold, and why I put this on is Organ Yard. I put this on because the Perigo family who lived in this house all became affected, we now know, from the same water source. On the 25th of August at 10 o'clock at night, Dinah, aged 18, was admitted. Her sister Sarah came in 2 days later. They were both factory girls. And Mother Mary was admitted 4 days later, along with her youngest daughter, Hannah, aged 10, who followed the next day. The whole family, bar the father, were in there. Now, the amazing thing about this is that out of all the 73 patients who were admitted between August and October, 36 were cured, 36 died, and 1 walked off without leave. So that was amazing. But in it, it tells us the occupations of all those people. And they're all lower classes. They're the poorest members of society. The factory workers, the labourers, the washerwomen, the shoemakers, the colliers, the potters, and the domestic servants. There is not one member of the Hunslet elite in there. Now, Captain Waterton and his wife had been fantastically generous to the people during that time there. And what he did was, he argued that the timely distribution of medicine amongst the working classes and poor should always take place before the disease takes hold. And a hospital should be prepared and ready before. Isn't it interesting to have the parallels with today in the Nightingale hospitals? These need to be ready before, not after the epidemic has taken off hundreds of the population. He argued that Hunslet had been stigmatized as dirty, and he felt that they needed to do something about the evils in their township and the accumulation of refuse. And he urged every man and woman to change their habits. And he said also as well, you can't just rely on the magistrates, the police and the town council. He was an incredible, generous man. And as a result of that, at the end of the epidemic, he was summoned to Hunslet National School near the chapel. And he was presented, along with his wife, with a vast array of wonderful gifts. He was given a purse containing £280 in gold. He was given a silver salver and a silver snuff box. His wife was given a gold bracelet set with rubies. And they also had the salver inscribed with, presented to George Edwin Waterton of Hunslet by 3,000 subscribers on the 12th day of February 1850 as a token of their gratitude for his gratuitous distribution of medicine unwearied labours to the public, and also for the voluntary loan of the premises as a hospital during the prevalence of this epidemic. And he wasn't alone to be rewarded. John Yewdall, who'd been secretary to the board, had done a fantastic job at keeping track of the expenses and putting pressure on the populace of Hunslet to pay more in to treat the poor. And this is his silver teapot. And you will see this in the Abbey House Museum collection. It still survives there. Now, after 1832, 1834, 1849, you would have thought that something would have been done. But this is Leeds Council by this state. So let's just reserve judgment. But let's just say that nothing really was done at all. Apart from for the water and the sewage. The Act of 1837 gave Leeds Corporation the power to provide piped water to the borough, but there were huge delays. The Improvement Act of 1842 had given them the power to cause sewers to be made, but again, that didn't really get underway in Hunslet till 1846. And the Public Health Act of 1848 set up a General Board of Health. But despite all that, the actual physical state of Hunslet continued to decline because more people flooded into the area. By 1851, nearly 20,000. And so in 1854, there was another outbreak, but this time in Hunslet Mills that we saw earlier by Mr. Wilkinson. And it was isolated to those mills. The Victoria Mills, next door, there wasn't one outbreak. Why was that? And that was because Victoria Mills, the gentleman here had paid to be connected to Leeds town water from Eccles. The Wilkinsons had not. Now those mills built by Fairbairn here, absolutely wonderful mills, brilliantly designed in a fireproof way, unfortunately took their water from the river and from a well beneath it. Now, when it broke out here, the central government became involved. They were really concerned as to why in this part cholera had come here, and it came from Westminster. And he observed that the river was heavily polluted, but by Hunslet Flax Mill it was virtually stagnant. But 150 yards upriver was the corporation's depot for street sweeping and night soil, which was appalling. The stench was truly appalling, and that they couldn't blame Wilkinson for that. And this map just shows the location. Victoria Mills, no cases. Hunslet Mills, 54 cases and deaths. Leeds Corporation store just upriver near where the bridge crosses on the motorway today. Now, his report noted that there were 56 water closets on the premises and that the waste was emptied directly into the semi-stagnant river, and that they pumped water from that river through 3 pipes, and that they took it from near the sewage outfall, and that they then heated this water up, and the steam generated from this water made a steamy atmosphere on the floor of the mill so that the threads of the flax wouldn't break. It was stored in open shallow troughs attached to machines. It was quite clear where this had come from. And so we were getting so near in 1854 to understanding that this wasn't miasma, it was water. But unfortunately, it wasn't to be a Leeds solution. And you see here Victoria Mills, and in the background, the great Wilkinson Hunslet Flax Mills, now restored beautifully into modern day flats. Now, eventually, during the next 20 years, clean water comes to Hunslet, piped water to everyone. Houses eventually get connected to the sewage system, and thankfully, they start to improve the quality of housing. In 1866, Leeds appoints its first officer of health, note when Liverpool had its, and at long last, the wretched depths, these open sewers, through the Act of 1866, were to be covered over. Now we know today, of course, that it's caused by the cholera vibrio, and that was discovered the same year as that outbreak in Leeds at Wilkinson's flax mill by Dr. John Snow, who realised that it was contaminated water. But it was to be not until 1883 that the German physician Robert Koch isolated the bacterium and finally discovered the cause of the disease. He said that it was caused through unsanitary water and food supply sources, and it supported Snow's theory of 20 years earlier. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Steve, for that wonderful, interesting lecture. We now have time for some questions. Nobody's posted any questions on the chat line. If you'd like to ask a question, please unmute yourself and ask the question now. While people are thinking, I'll have a question for you, Steve. Who was the landlord who owned these houses that you showed us?
Sorry?
We know who the landlord was who owned the poor housing that you showed us.
That's a really interesting question, is that? Can you hear me okay? Yes?
It's the problem.
The landlords of Hunslet were many, but the one I think most of you will have heard of the Armitage family. They lived in Farnley Hall, and the Armitages had been in Hunslet since at least the 17th century, and they had built up a huge property portfolio in that area. So they were one who you could class as slum landlords. Edward, by this time, living in the luxury of Farnley Hall, living as a gentleman interested in agricultural pursuits. Another family which you will no doubt be familiar with, the Brandling family of the Middleton collieries, the Fenton family, who owned significant land there, the Busk family, the Couplands. So these are the middle, classes, and they, shall we say, one of the reasons I found studying this so important is that the 1849 epidemic is so severe that even families who are working class and have become mega wealthy, like the Bowers, they were always proud to stay in Hunslet. They're very proud of the mess that they've made, because where there's muck, there's brass. But there are other families like the Goodmans, for example, in Sundial House, which is opposite Costco. They very early on twig that Hunslet is going down the rattle, and they move out to Roundhay. It was Goodman House. Some of you will know it as Beechwood there. And so you get this flight to the northern suburbs of the elite. But also, because families like the Fentons become so wealthy, they marry their daughters and sons into the gentry and the aristocracy. And so they quite naturally move away from it. And they put their properties in the hands of agents. Edward Armitage, for example, he looks after Lady Wake's property in Hunslet. So the people who own them become more and more divorced from the property they own, and their agents see how awful it is, but they don't.
Thank you, Steve. There's a related question from Clive, who asked, did any of the wealthy die from cholera?
There is no record, Clive, of any of the wealthy members of Hunslet dying from the cholera. No, none at all. The one who catches it, which I mentioned, was Wilkinson, but he recovers. And tragically for him, he obviously becomes an exceptionally unpopular person in Hunslet. But he dies a broken man later when his mills basically go bust to get into financial condition. But no, there are no records of any one of the wealthy people dying of it.
Thank you. Any more questions? Just unmute yourself and ask the question if you have a question to ask. There are lots of people posting comments. Brilliant lecture, brilliantly delivered. Thank you.
Oh, well, I'm glad. I'm glad of that, and I really do need to pay tribute to Sue, who if there hadn't been lockdown, I was in Scotland today, but I wanted to support the Thoresby Society lectures, so I pre-recorded it. So I'm glad I got all my notes here, ready to do should anything go wrong, plan B. But I think we should also thank you, Alan, because you've done a fantastic job organising all these lectures. And as I started with, I am IT idiot. I'm hopeless with IT. So I am in awe of your skill at making this work properly today for us.
There are also now questions on the chat line, which I will read out to you. What happened to the Cholera Cemetery and the graves? You showed us the cemetery and you said it existed until recently.
Yeah, it became an edge of a builder's yard for Leeds City Council. And then when they built the motorway, of course, they had to move it. And so it was then moved up to Woodhouse Hill. And the stone itself still exists there. A fascinating reminder. But again, when I was seeing them burying the dead in New York, it immediately mirrored that digging of the huge pit and dumping the body. It doesn't matter who you are, rich or poor, you're going in that cholera grave, and you're not going down 5 feet deep, you're going down 10 feet deep. You know, they were very savvy. And I think what comes across to me is two things. Firstly, that what the 1849 epidemic pointed out to the Hunslet elite was this population was too large for the old-fashioned systems of township meetings, manorial courts, etc., to do the business. And they basically become subsumed within Leeds Council. And that was everything from police provision, lighting, water, sewage disposal. Leeds starts to take over after that, and there is no fighting it. So it's twofold. The elite leave, but they also hand over the reins to Leeds Council, Leeds Corporation during that. So that's one thing that stands out. But the other thing that stands out is the kindness and the bravery of the people that lived there. Would you want to go into a house with COVID in the moment? Absolutely, I would not. Yet those 3 doctors bravely went in there, as did what Killingbeck refers to as the Christians of Hunslet. And that was the middle class ladies taking food and clothing and blankets. You know, absolutely wonderful, a wonderful reflection on society.
Of course, National Health Service workers still put themselves at risk to treat people.
Absolutely.
Hilary asks, what was the powder treatment Captain Waterton?
Oh, Dino, that is such an interesting question, is that? Obviously, I've long connection with Thackeray Medical Museum. And my friend there, Alan Humphreys, I asked him that very question. And I also asked if there was a portrait of him, because we don't know what Captain Waterton looked like. His cousin, obviously, is the great botanist of Waterton of Wakefield. But we don't know. We haven't a portrait, and we don't know what was in those powders. It was a secret formula. But what was remarkable, and why the internet is so great, and why I'm so passionate about the Thoresby Society's digitisation programme, I spent hours with Captain Waterton tapped in, and eventually I found in the library, the Surgeon General's office in Washington, can you believe? I found, I don't know if you can see that, Captain Waterton's report on Hunslet in 1849. We haven't got a copy in this country, but it ended up in America. And so I could download it. And you just think, well, isn't that fantastic? So a great question. I wish I knew the answer to that, but people genuinely believed it worked. And there must have been more in that. There must have been something, whatever was in there, that did assist and facilitate recovery. I mean, 73 people in that hospital and 36 recover. That is damn good when, you know, basically 50% because one walks off.
There's a related question from Paul who asks, is it possible to look at the survey of the habitations of the poor report? Is that available?
No, it isn't. And what is available is a whole raft. If you go into the West Yorkshire Archives site for the Leeds office, it's in the Hunslet papers there. and it is about the cholera epidemic, and there's a huge amount. But by far and away, the best material on Hunslet and cholera is in our Killingbeck collection. And he writes at length about the cholera. I mean, I didn't have time to read, obviously, a lot of it out to you, but it's just magical stuff. It's like some idiot on the Board of Health tells Captain Waterton that they no longer need his powders, that he's spoiling the scene, he's dominating everything, and he should clear off. So he puts a notice on his door and says, sorry, no more powders. The Board of Health in Hunslet have decided it's not worth it. There's a near riot, and miraculously, the chair of the Board of Health immediately says, I have no idea or knowledge who did that. It's absolute lies. Please, Captain Waterton. You know, now all that kind of lively detail is what's in the Killingbeck box. And I had so much pleasure reading it. It was just such fun.
So you think there's material there for somebody to work on and turn into a publication?
Well, I think a certain John Turney should be listening to this, and I think there is an obvious article of a medical man of such worth.
A question from Belinda. When were the last cases of cholera in Hunslet?
Don't worry.
When were the last cases of cholera?
In Hunslet.
The last ones I know of is 1854. But what happens is that if you go into Leeds Local and Family History Library, when you get appointed then the medical officer of health, all his reports are in there. And what's great about those is they give a very detailed breakdown of where those things are. But I know of no case after 1854, but I haven't been through every year of those wonderful, wonderful reports.
Thank you. Another question. Was Captain Waterton related to the Wakefield family of that name?
Yes, he was. He was a cousin. He was a cousin of the man. And I mean, we're not clear why he ends up in Hunslet at all. I mean, he's been a military gentleman, toured extensively, and then comes here and gets involved in Waterloo Mills. And I find it interesting that he's there because Waterloo Mills were originally built by John Story. They are the first cotton mills in Leeds. They're expanded by a man called Ard Walker, who was almost the great wine merchant of Leeds and multi-millionaire in today's terms. He loses a fortune on those cotton mills, which don't prosper. And then, of course, they become part of the Ingham family cloth mills and produce some very high quality woolen cloth there. Some of you may know Benjamin Ingham, who is the great perfecter of Marsala wine and was responsible for giving the money for the creation of the new church, the tower of which still survives there today. And he's a fascinating character. Look, browse on him. Yes.
The final question in the chat line, the day book that you mentioned in the Thackeray Museum,
yes,
is that available?
Yes, it is. Hopefully after the pandemic, Thackeray Medical Museum will open again. All you need to do is say that you're interested in doing research on it. And if you click on the website, it takes you through to the research section, and Alan Humphreys will get that out of the safe for you. It is an amazing survivor, as is Yewdall's teapot. You know, how amazing that remains in the Leeds Museums and Galleries collection. We're very, very fortunate to have these things there, which add such character to Hunslet during that period. You get that real sense of community.
So a final question from Alan Mann. Did the age profile for cholera deaths simulate what we're now seeing with the current pandemic?
Oh, that's a very, very interesting question, is that. It was not, it didn't hit the elderly or the young. It basically hit anyone and everyone who was living in a poor area. And I think one of the interesting things about the survival of the matron's book is you begin to see that smattering of all ages hitting it. So it isn't a bit like care home syndrome in the current pandemic. it just hits the poor community.
Thank you very much, Steve. Is there any last questions anyone wants to ask orally? Well, if not, can I?
Yes,
Sorry.
Yes, please.
Do
yes, we're trying, waving.
you say who you are? Is this Michael? Yeah.
Yes, just I think it was the fact it came in waves, and it was so the morbidity was so great, which was so interesting and such an event. But it didn't actually carry off as many people in deaths as endemic diseases, which carried on and therefore went noticed. Measles killed more people in these.
Yeah.
Diarrhea did. This is interesting. It was because it was sort of almost like an invasion of cholera that it became such a focal point. And all these other things were carrying off more people and were not given attention.
Well, I think it's the shock factor which I referred to at the start. If you're turning blue, you know, that is going to grab somebody's attention, isn't it? That is going to grab your attention. I think you're right, Michael. You know, they used to call it summer diarrhea deaths, used to, you know, literally wipe away hundreds. But, you know, it's the shocking nature of that disease that I think sticks in everyone's memory. But it was a great agent eventually for change. And I think that's what we need to know. It was a changing attitude of the corporation and changing attitude of the middle classes that Hunslet was no longer the place for them.
Thank you.
Can I ask Stephen how close you are to publishing a book on Hunslet?
Oh, Diane, I could kiss you. Yes. that splendid fellow, Dr. Kevin Grady, is at the moment wading, and I use that. I've had my friend Jeff Driver has waded through the 100,000 words of it. Kevin at the moment is wading through it, and he is editing it, and I have to give him some toffee. He's doing a brilliant job re-editing that book so that it flows to the reader. I'm a great enthusiast and therefore write at great length and ramble all over the place and then flip to another subject and assume everybody knows anything anyway. Whereas Kevin looks at it in the cold light of day and puts rigor into my work and asks some stinking awful questions, but good questions to ask. And so he's completely restructured it, and it should be out in April. It mirrors very much the book that Kevin and I did on the history of Leeds, except this one is in full colour. So it's 300 pages, 200 illustrations throughout, and I hope it, even though it costs £20, £21 to print, very generous people, including the Leeds Phil and Lit, have helped to subsidise. So not only can I give copies to the schools and the libraries and museums, but I'm hoping that it will retail at £10. So it's truly a bargain, and I'm aiming for April with a bit of luck, providing Kevin asks no more awkward questions.
Thank you.
Can I invite everyone now to unmute themselves so we can give Steve the round of applause that he deserves? That's most interesting.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We look forward to
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can I just end the meeting by saying this is the last of our November lunchtime talks. The Thoresby Society traditionally has a break in December, but we have a programme of lectures in the new year, which you can find on our website, and we hope to see all of you then. So this is my last chance, although we're rather early, to wish you a happy Christmas and I hope a very happy and healthy new year. Thank you very much again, Steve.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hey, Christmas.